Welcome to the At Risk podcast. I'm your host, Maxilia, and today we're going to deep dive into the political underbelly and spill tea that could potentially cost me my career. Today we're tackling Project 2025, a plan that claims to shape the future, but looks more like a scene from Handmaid's Tale. And I mean the scariest thing you've ever seen in your entire life. From reproductive rights to workplace equity, the project threatens to roll back decades of progress. Today we're joined by a special guest who's stepping into the unknown with us. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. But first, let's talk about the big news shaking up the political scene. A Turkish-American protester protesting against Israel's occupation of Palestine was unfortunately murdered recently. She was shot by Israeli troops in the West Bank. Her name was Asunar Edji. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but currently right now her family is in current despair, and they are hoping for her body to be returned back to them. Recently, 6 hostages, including an Israeli American, have been killed, leading to massive protests against Netanyahu from citizens in Israel over his response to Gaza and his refusal for a ceasefire, as well as his handling of the hostages altogether. So basically, people in Israel are protesting, asking for Netanyahu, the prime minister that they have, to step down because they're really upset over how everything's been going on with the Palestinian war, or genocide, we should say. And in the United States, things aren't looking much better. Georgia and Maryland were both rocked this week by school shootings. The Georgia high school shooting suspect and his father were both sent to have their first court appearance. And it's kind of wild because it looks like they're both going to be tried because the dad was the one that bought the gun for the son. And then in Maryland, there is a 15-year-old boy who died by the hands of a 16-year-old classmate. So in Georgia, you have a school shooter. 4 people have died, unfortunately, several injured. And in Maryland, 1 child has died as a result of inappropriate gun reform in our country, or lack of gun reform in our country, I should say. And most notably, Vice President Harris has officially become the Democratic nominee. The DNC is over, and she's announced her running mate, Tim Walz. Later on in the episode, we'll go into great detail about who Tim Walz is and why we think that she picked him over Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro, Josh Shapiro was who most people thought was going to get it. But yeah. We're going to talk more about what that looks like for the United States. What does this mean for the election, and how will it impact the fight against Project 2025? We're about to break down why Project 2025 is a disaster for women and what we can do to fight back. Let's get into it. As you guys can see, I am joined today by a very, very special guest, me, Bear. Although she doesn't know too much about Project 2025 or Tim Walz, she's going to go into great detail with me. I'm going to break down almost everything, and she's going to ask the questions that you probably have at home.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bear, and I'm actually really excited to learn more about 2025 from Maxilia.
Awesome. So first, we're going to get into the vice presidential pick that Kamala Harris has made, Tim Walz. Tim Walz was selected as Vice President Kamala Harris's pick for several key reasons. He's actually the governor from Minnesota. He was the only person from last month's episode, I should say, who was in fact a teacher out of the vice president picks that we've made. So if you watched last month's episode, which you did, Tim Walz was one of the people that was on that list of potential vice president picks. If you guys haven't seen that video, please go back and watch it. Highly recommend. Do you remember what was said about Tim Walz in the podcast episode? Totally fine if you didn't. If you don't remember.
I don't think I remember. Can you refresh it for me?
Yeah, of course. So Tim Walz, we didn't spend a lot of time on him in that podcast episode because we were really gushing over Mark Kelly, who ended up not being the pick, which is fine because Tim Walz is actually the most progressive person out of the pick. He is from Minnesota. He's actually the governor from Minnesota. Okay. He has a deep commitment to middle-class families. He's actually the reason in Minnesota that you don't have to pay for community college. Okay. He made it free.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah. So he's also a veteran, similar to Mark Kelly. He served in the National Guard for 24 years. Coming from a military family myself, I have a soft spot for people that do military service for this country, given how hard and difficult it is that they go through all the things that they have to do for this country.
Yeah.
He's from the Midwest, which gives him a really good opportunity to bring in more votes because people were concerned that we weren't going to get enough votes from the Midwest. And he's really popular because of some of the stuff that he did with like getting tampons into schools so that girls would be able to have free products.
That's well needed.
And when he was a teacher, he was the first person to create the straight and queer alliance at his school so that like queer kids at his school wouldn't continue to get bullied. And he was also a football coach, so he worked with the football team to make sure that they were like all allies to ensure that the gay kids at the school wouldn't get bullied.
Okay, so how did he go from an educational background and stepped into politics?
It's interesting. After he did his service in the National Guard, he decided that he wanted to run for senator, and he actually won. And then through his bout as senator, he became increasingly popular and would one day go on to become the governor of Minnesota.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so he becomes governor of Minnesota. He's really popular, really progressive. Kamala Harris is looking for a vice president pick. She's looking to make herself look more like she's not super left-leaning, like not as left-leaning as a Bernie Sanders, like free school and free education. So she picks the guy that kind of looks like he's willing to do that, which is Tim Walz. He's done it already for his state. So now people won't think that she's as like progressive as AOC. They'll see her as like more in the middle, which is what most Americans like for their presidents to be. It's literally why Joe Biden won. People were like, we need a centrist. We can't have Bernie Sanders. He's too progressive. So she's gonna model herself as like a moderate Democrat, make herself look less progressive, but then the person she picked is super progressive.
Okay. It was a good balance.
Yeah. That's basically what they try to do. So the selection process is expedited because there was like less than 3 months to pick a vice president.
Yeah, fair.
And with Tim Walz emerging as the favorite with strong performance and media appearance, he was the one that coined the Republicans are weird. I don't know if you ever heard people going around saying that Republicans are weird now. He's the first person to go on TV as a politician to be
live
like,
and say that live.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was like, these people are weird. And I was like, you're right. You are so right.
I can't deny it.
And now, welcome the next Vice President of the United States, Tim Walz.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, for the trust you put in me, but maybe more so, thank you for bringing back the joy. Minnesota's strength comes from our values, our commitment to working together, to seeing past our differences, to always being willing to lend a helping hand. Those are the same values I learned on the family farm and tried to instill in my students. Donald Trump sees the world a little differently than us. First of all, he doesn't know the first thing about service. He doesn't have time for it because he's too busy serving himself. He mocks our laws. He sows chaos and division. He froze in the face of the COVID crisis. And make no mistake, violent crime was up under Donald Trump. That's not even counting the crimes he committed. In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make. Even if we wouldn't make the same choice for ourselves, there's a golden rule. Mind your own damn business. And don't believe him when he plays dumb. He knows exactly what Project 2025 will do to restrict our freedoms. J.D. Vance literally wrote the foreword for the architect of the Project 2025 agenda.
So a lot of people thought Josh Shapiro was going to become vice president.
Okay.
He is Jewish. He is the governor of Philadelphia right now. He's really popular, but it came out that back when he was an undergrad that he wrote an essay about Israel and Palestine, about what's going on. And he basically said that there will never be freedom. A lot of people think that what's happening in the Middle East just started happening on October 7th, but this
It's something that's been going on
for years.
Yeah.
For several years. So much so that Josh Shapiro, who's in his 60s now, I want to say, wrote about it when he was an undergrad student.
That's been a minute.
Yeah, it's a while ago. I didn't read the article that talked about it, and I didn't read the paper, but a lot of people were freaking out on social media, on Twitter especially, saying that he's a Zionist. I cannot confirm or deny whether he's a Zionist or not, but I think that's the reason he wasn't
So that
picked.
one assumption, like if you do something way back, it just comes back to haunt you.
It could come back to haunt
Okay,
you, especially like when you're writing theses and all. Is it theses? I guess if you're writing a thesis on something,
Yeah.
then maybe people will. I think he says that he no longer has those beliefs, and I'm inclined to like, I don't know him as a person. If he says he doesn't believe in that stuff anymore, then he doesn't. But when you're running for president, like I think like when Obama was running for president, things about what he did in his university days came out as well. We found out that he smoked cigarettes back in the day. There's pictures of him playing basketball and all these things that have nothing to do with the actual election, but people were intrigued by it. I mean, right now people are coming out about Kamala Harris saying like, basically there was these news articles saying like, oh, her political basically said it, but like they were interviewing her old like interns and old staff, and they were saying like
they're going deep diving.
Yeah. And they were saying things like, oh, you know, like Kamala Harris is really difficult to have as a boss because she expects you to actually know the information. She wants you to know the why and the where, what, why, like the 3 W's and things like that. Like she's kind of a hard ass when it comes to like information. To me, as someone who works for a politician, you are expected as a staff to know a lot of stuff, sometimes even know more than what they know. Your job is essentially to brief them.
I feel like, doesn't that like kind of set you up for success in the long term?
It should,
because you learn the stuff. Granted,
I mean, I'm sure
a hard
it sucks.
boss,
I'm
definitely
sure it
sucks.
But as someone who works in politics, I'm like, that just sounds like you work in politics. Like they do expect you to know a lot of information. That's a part of the job.
Okay.
So that's the worst that's come out against her right now. Some other things about Kamala Harris, she had her interview recently and on CNN, and they actually asked her about what's going on in Palestine and what's going on with Israel. And she basically made a statement saying something along the lines of like, she basically said, and I don't know how to say this like super nicely because in the last episode, I made a joke saying that I stan Kamala Harris. And like, obviously that's a joke because we can never stan politicians. And this is probably one of the reasons for that, because she basically continued to reiterate that Israel has a right to defend itself. Everyone understands that. No one is questioning whether or not Israel has a right to defend itself after the horrendous acts that happened on October 7th. It was just interesting that when she was asked if she would stop sending weapons or if she would do something like that, like if she would do anything different, she essentially said no. She was like, I just want to be really clear that Israel has a right to defend itself. And all of us are like, no, we heard you. Are you still going to send weapons? Are you going to enact the Leahy laws? Do you know what the Leahy laws are?
No.
Okay, the Leahy laws are named after a senator, Senator Leahy, back in the 1990s.
Okay.
Basically, it's a list of amendments and a set of human U.S. rights laws that says that we cannot send weapons or provide military assistance to foreign security forces that are committing mass, like, human rights violations.
Okay, that's fair.
So he himself has openly said that he believes that, remember, the law, he wrote the law and it's named after him. He believes that America is like violating the Leahy laws. Yeah, a lot of people were expecting.
See how that can be like shown.
Yeah, because you're like, what are we talking about right now? But that's fine. We're not here to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. We're here to talk about Project 2025. But those are just some interesting things that have been happening in the news and have been happening with Kamala Harris and Vice President Harris. And that's why I thought it was important to highlight the lives that were recently lost in the Middle East as this tragedy continues onward. And if you can donate and give resources to ensure the safety of others and to ensure that people are able to eat and have access to clean food and water, you should do so. All right, so we're going to get into Project 2025, which is, while we talk about the nightmare that's happening in the Middle East, we're going to talk about the nightmare that could possibly be happening in the United States of America.
Which I'm not looking forward to. Okay, let's do this.
All right. Yeah, I personally wouldn't be looking forward to Project 2025. We live here in the United States of America. It basically, for Project 2025 is a political blueprint
Okay.
that's being pushed as a vision for the future for the next conservative president of the United States, which if Donald Trump wins, he would be the next conservative president of the United
Correct.
States.
Yeah.
So this is basically a blueprint and almost, it feels like a manifesto of things to do in the United States, basically when Trump becomes president again.
When did this originated? Like, who came up originally with the idea of Project 2025 and why? And like, as it's being constructed, what are the big heads that are stepping in to put their opinions onto what Project 2025 is supposed to look like? Yeah.
That's a great question. Project 2025 is actually been created by the Heritage Foundation. It's a think tank that was created during the, I want to say, Nixon or Reagan, one of those presidents. It was created to continue to push out conservative legislation and policies to kind of bring back America from, it kind of started after like all the civil rights stuff was going on, all the like diversity and like gender equity work that was happening during the time. So the Heritage Foundation was created to create laws and policies to kind of like help conservative politicians have like legacy and policies that like are more conservative. Okay. And some of the key people that helped write the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 is a lot of people that were on Trump's team. So Trump's former staff, a lot of his former staff wrote and like helped write and prepare things for Project 2025, were key people in the planning for Project 2025. And that's kind of just like how it is. And so for women, children, members of the LGBTQIA plus community, it looks like a scene genuinely out of a horror movie, because some of the things that they're asking and some of the things that they're trying to get rid of are things that have literally been plots of books and movies. But I mean, if that's what they want to do.
Would you consider this a regression? Because we are like moving forward into the future, instead of like more focusing on things that we need to do for that future, we're trying to backtrack and get rid of laws that were created to protect groups of people.
I mean, I would definitely say it's a regression. It really depends on who you ask, because if you're not conservative, and there's even conservatives or evangelicals that are conservative that don't 110% agree with Project 2025. In fact, Project 2025 has received a lot of backlash, and Donald Trump's actually been trying to distance himself from Project 2025. Yeah, he's like, I don't know those people. I don't know where they got that from. But most of his staff worked on it, so it's like, be so serious right now.
So do you think that he's distancing himself now, but do you think that he might,
use the policy anyway?
Use the policy anyways if he becomes president? He
has no real policy plan. They wrote the policy plan for him. He didn't really have policy the first time around. He was kind of just he never built the wall. He tried to do the Muslim ban. Then he got blocked by judges. Like, he had no real policy in place. But this is like a real policy proposal. Like, if I became president, I want to enact these laws. I want to get rid of this. I want to change this department and X, Y, and Z. So Project 2025, as we discussed, is a comprehensive policy blueprint created by the Heritage Foundation. The main parts that it's tackling are reproductive rights, workplace harassment laws, divorce laws, and education laws.
Is the workplace harassment laws at least good? Or getting better?
It's to make them worse.
Oh.
It's like to take away claw some of those things back.
Okay.
It wasn't like, we're going to make stronger sexual harassment, workplace harassment laws. It was more like, we'll get into it, guys. Okay. But we're going to start off with reproductive rights and why we keep making the Handmaid's Tale joke here.
Okay.
All right. So it plans to restrict funding and supporting for reproductive health services through using different types of laws that have been in place throughout the years, including the Comstock Act. The Comstock Act was a federal law that was criminalized by this anti-masturbation activist. He basically said that anything lewd and inappropriate can't be sent through the mail. And basically anything that's obscene or indecent should be criminalized. So the law was passed in 1873, and he was a devout Christian that believed contraceptives were bad.
Okay.
Like, he was super anti. So when he says obscene and lewd and like terrible things have to be banned, he's talking about birth control.
Oh, you know why I completely misunderstood you and thought you were talking about like public indecency?
No. He's talking about birth control.
Oh no.
He's talking about contraceptives. He's talking about abortion-related materials. So, like, any pamphlets on educational materials on abortions and things like that would be banned.
It's just very interesting how someone that doesn't go through the things that women go through is making the laws on these kind of things.
Yes, he makes a huge loss. To him, as a devout Christian, what makes him the right person is him being this, like, anti-abortion, anti-masturbation, and being this religious figure. Like, he's like, I'm an activist, therefore I have the right to tell women how to, like, handle their bodies.
Apparently.
Yeah, so in the Comstock Act, and what Project 2025 wants to do is use the Comstock Act to ban things like people getting their abortion pills in the mail, to ban people from being able to get things like their birth control pills in the mail.
So are they just making it harder for people to really navigate life with birth control, or are they completely trying to get rid of birth control?
I mean, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, if you get rid of birth control, you get rid of a whole group of people that are relying on it. And that's something that a lot of people have been kind of iffy about. Some really hard-leaning extremist conservatives believe like things like birth control are problematic because you're interfering with what God wants. Although those people are never thinking about the fact that certain people have menstrual disorders like PCOS, which is it's actually PCOS Awareness Month. It's polycystic ovary syndrome, and it stands for, or it's a menstrual disorder that can cause severe and painful cramping for people. There's all the other menstrual disorders such as endometriosis, which is another severe menstrual disorder. It is extremely hard to live with if you're not getting the right resources. And some of the ways to mitigate the factors of the symptoms that you have is to get birth control. IUDs can stop your period, the Depo shot stopping people's periods, and sometimes birth control helps regulate your menstruation so that you can have a better menstrual process.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Like, as someone that has endometriosis myself, that,
So do I.
like, seeing this is definitely scary and something that I wouldn't want taking place at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, like, in the news right now, all they're talking about is, like, oh my God, like, he wants to, or when I say he wants to, I'm talking about Donald Trump, because as far as I'm concerned, Donald Trump is closely connected to Project 2025, no matter how much he tries to push himself away from it. But I think it's really interesting because, like, in the media, they keep talking about, like, oh my God, he wants to do a federal abortion ban, which means, like, across the United States of America, abortion would be illegal. Like, it wouldn't just be like, oh, like, you know how it's illegal now, like, it's not a federal constitutional right anymore, but we live in New Jersey, which means, oh, like, abortion is still legal here. Abortion is still legal in Minnesota. Yeah. Abortion is still legal in certain cities.
Determined by the state, yeah.
Determined by the state. But what they would want to do is, like, federally ban it. So, like, no one can have access to abortion.
Yeah, but, you know, like, birth control isn't just about, like, with protection against kids. As having endometriosis, like we talked about, there's so much pain that comes with being
in that type of situation. Yes. Yeah, it's a disability, and it's a hard disability to live with.
Taking off work because you're in so much pain, like,
from your menstruation.
So
school.
Like, this is not just like harming us in the terms of like trying to with the
like make
child.
People have kids.
Yeah, it's also like you're making my way of life more difficult.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's kind of what Project 2025 needs, why people need to be more vigilant about it and why people need to pay more attention, because it's not as simple as it sounds. Like, you hear some of these things and you're like, oh, they're making sure that lewd things don't go through the mail. I don't think that's a bad thing. But then when you look deeper and you're like, oh, he's talking about birth control.
Yeah.
Like, that's not the same
I would have completely misunderstood if you didn't tell me what that was focused on.
Yep. I mean, hey, Anthony Comstock, everybody. A class act, man. A class act. Mind you, he was in 1873. They're talking about a law that was established in the 1800s to be implemented in 2024 or 2025, because it's Project 2025. So the workplace equality. So they want to roll back on protections against gender discrimination and equal pay incentives. So they think that like people are being too woke in the workplace, and people shouldn't be able to tell people that like men and women are forced and required to make the same amount of money, which we actually still don't. White women make way more money than all other races of women in America, and they make 83 cents to the dollar for a man. When they say 83 cents to the dollar, they're talking about like white women to white men ratios.
Okay.
But like black women and Hispanic women make substantially less than white women make to the white man's dollar. So depending on your race, you're making less than that.
Still fighting for equality.
So you're still fighting for equality, but they're talking about rolling back protections. Want to even do something to get rid of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which basically said that you couldn't not hire someone simply because they're pregnant.
Yeah.
And it's like, as we get older, as people decide that they want to like build their families and want to build a life outside of like what people perceive to be the traditional stance, pregnant women are going to work. The economy is terrible. Everyone has to work these days. So pregnant women deserve that.
Do you think it will backfire? Because when you're creating laws like this, people retaliate, especially those that are not in agreement with these things. Especially when you're thinking of like discriminating against women that are pregnant. You don't think the population of people wanting to give birth is gonna decrease, especially since this is a generation of women that are like really stepping up and really wanting to like own their lives, and holding them back in any kind of way, I feel like will definitely lead to some
consequences.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's really interesting, but how can you retaliate against something that you don't know? Like before we started this podcast episode, you mentioned, I've heard of Project 2025, but I don't really know what Project 2025 is. A lot of people are like that. A lot of people that are minding their business, and a lot of people that are like, I'm apolitical, I don't want to get involved in politics, which is a privilege. But let's just, to be fair, that is a privilege to be able to be like, I don't care about what's happening in the world because it doesn't impact me. Things shouldn't just be impacting you for you to care about them. But here's something that is like set to impact not only women, not only children, but members of the LGBTQIA plus community and people of color.
And
if you
a lot
fall
of
in
them
any
don't
of those
even realize
categories,
it.
that impacts you. And people of different religious groups, because the religion that they're like implementing throughout Project 2025 is the Christian God.
Okay.
Like when Anthony Comstock was a devout Christian, Donald Trump's MAGA base, majority of them are devout Christians. And so it is that evangelical God that they believe in that they are saying, and I'm not saying that they're right about how they portray God or whatever, but that's what they're saying is like how they build off the basis of like why this should be a thing. So even if you have like, even if you're a really devout religious person, if you're not serving the Christian God, you might also find yourself to be in a really tough position living in the United States of America.
That makes sense.
The Title VII also is in place to prohibit sexual orientation discrimination and gender identity discrimination, which means if someone is trans or someone is like queer, you cannot fire them simply because they are queer.
Yeah.
You cannot choose not to hire them simply because they're not queer, or choose to harass them at work. But they want to take back all of those provisions. And then you ask yourself, but why? And they think that wokeness is destroying the American families. So therefore, if we take all the laws that protect people, then that'll be even better. Next up is my favorite one, is marriage and divorce laws.
Oh, no.
In Project 2025, there are proposals to make it more difficult for women to divorce their husbands, potentially trapping them in abusive and unsatisfactory marriages.
And how do they expect to do this?
So basically what they're talking about is, and I'll talk about a little bit about it more later, is throughout Project 2025, they sprinkle out certain policies, like making it so that like if you get a divorce and you put your husband on child support, they want to give your husband a child support tax credit break. And they said that the reason they want to do that is because it'll encourage people not to get divorced. So by giving your ex-husband a tax break and finding out like, oh, if I get a divorce, I'm not guaranteed to have child support if you have kids, then that makes less people want to get a divorce. So then you stay married longer.
Yeah, but
and then they make it difficult for you to be able to get a divorce depending on like the policies that they're putting in place in terms of like how you can go about getting a divorce and what are the rules for what you want to do to get a divorce. Like the reasoning behind divorces will be like a lot more lenient on men, but for women are going to have like a higher standard of burden of proof of trying to get out of their marriage.
So now marriages are going to be traps, basically.
Yes, essentially, which I think, if this is my opinion, I feel like that will lead to less people getting married, and then I feel like we'll have a birth rate problem like South Korea has been happening right now because of all the misogyny,
Mm-hmm.
not misandry, because that's hate towards men. Mm-hmm. All of the misogyny that's been going on in South Korea right now with all of the
crimes against women,
the nth room stuff that's been going on.
Okay.
There's some new stuff happening with some underage kids. They were recently protesting over things like access to abortion and things of that nature, which they recently got. But because of everything that's been happening in South Korea, the birth rate has gone down. And a lot of philosophers and a lot of people believe it's because of the fact that people are misogynistic and women don't want to get married to these men. Also, the economy is really bad. Cost of living is super high, so people just choose not to get married. And most people, especially in a religious conservative state, if you're not going to have kids unless you're married. So then they just don't have kids.
Yeah, if it's tit for tat, then it's just like, I'm not.
Which isn't necessarily going to be the case in the United States of America. People don't necessarily need to be married to have children. We see that all the time.
Yes, correct.
But I imagine that will impact the marriage rate, which could possibly impact the birth rate among women.
Not only that, we haven't
men.
even discussed about the potential, like, the benefits for abusers that are definitely going to use this to their advantage.
Oh,
to keep
yes.
women
It's already so hard to leave abusive relationships.
So now you're making it so much harder on women.
Oh, yeah, of course. Of course. And they're not looking at it that way, the way that we're looking at it, but that's kind of just some of the things in regards to Project 2025, like just highlighting things. Like they want to reduce access to certain healthcare services, targeting maternal and mental health services, potentially undermining overall women's health. They want to do things with education policies, limiting educational opportunities for women, impacting scholarships and funding.
Okay. I think it's really interesting that you bring a lot of these points up. And one of the common things that I see that is constantly mentioned is women.
Yes,
so
because that's who we're targeting. It's women, children, and queer people.
Is to have women stay in marriages, have women not have access to the amount of education and opportunities, scholarships, etc. Why is it that it's so focused on women? What is it that makes that the focus of 2020, the Project 2025?
I think if you look over the years, so the civil rights movement led to a lot of big changes. We always talk about the civil rights movement in conjunction of like what it did for Black people in the United States, but the civil rights movement did a lot of things for women. A lot of things for women. I mean, we have Title VII that prevents you from being able to discriminate against people for their gender identity, which means you can't say, I'm not going to hire you just because you're a woman. Or things like not allowing people to discriminate against you because you're pregnant. So not being able to do those types of things. If you look out throughout the trajectory of the world, you'll see that like women have become increasingly more independent. They make more money. They're more college educated in the United States. And so you're starting to see that this generation of people that do not need women. And when you think under patriarchy works in a way that men are supposed to be at the top. Men are supposed to be held in high regard and the breadwinners and all these different things. But if women do it, then like, what's the purpose for men? Under patriarchy, that is. I'm not saying that men don't share value, but I'm saying under patriarchy, if women are the providers and they live happier lives without men and they're college educated and they're able to like provide for themselves, and women are more likely to have like better personal friendships and like community building than men, with the exception of like possibly wanting kids, why do you need men?
I'm hearing a lot of fear.
And that's just like in a heteronormative sense.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just one of those things, and it doesn't look great for members of the LGBTQIA plus community either. The plan calls for they call for a new agency to be called the Department of Life that will take an official stance that families are made up of only a married father, a married mother, and a child. So they're not talking about gay marriage. Like they're saying like the sanctity of marriage and a marriage that will be identified
as marriage.
Is that between a man, a woman, and their child.
Okay.
It's really important to note that they're also talking about children, because a lot of people that are members of the LGBTQIA plus community and just people throughout the year in 2024 have chosen to just either not have kids or don't want kids or have whatever reasoning for not having kids. But it's really important to note they're talking about a man, a woman, and children.
Okay.
That's a family unit to them.
Okay.
And that's a direct attack against the LGBTQIA plus community, because like, what are you trying to say? Like, are you saying that like two women that have a child together that are married, like, are you saying that their child is not like the same as someone else's kid? Are you saying that their marriage is not as sacred as someone else's marriage?
Invalidated, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, and that's just the time that we live in. And it continues to go on and on and on. A direct quote from Project 2025 is, "Pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political guardian knot exuberantly biting by desperate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare." What all of that means is basically like all you guys have been doing with all this like pro-LGBT, pro-pronoun stuff, all you guys have done is made pornography manifest throughout the United States. Like, whoa, trans ideology, like having people be supportive of being trans, like they think that it pretty much creates like a problem in the United States. So Project 2025 wants to deny the existence of trans people, basically being like, no more trans people, no more of this like ideology of like people's pronouns, sexual orientation, just like all of these terrible things. And remember, like, a lot of people on the really right-leaning conservative right, they believe that like gay people are the reason for things like school shootings. They think that gay people are the reason for like why children are doing bad in school. They think gay people are the reason for like
so
why...
it's just putting the blame.
The blame is being put on all the queer people.
Yeah.
And it's calling for replacing all LGBT equity policies to be removed and to support the formation of a stable, married, nuclear family. And they keep saying a stable, married nuclear family.
Yeah.
And a nuclear family is usually like you have a mom, a dad, and your children.
Yep.
So that's not including single parents.
Which you can't control.
You can't control that sometimes. Sometimes you're just a single parent. So a little something else about this slide is that when they're talking about people who should be criminalized for the act of pornography, not only are they talking about queer people, but they're talking about people who produce and distribute it.
Okay.
And they're talking about teachers and librarians. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classified as registered sex offenders, and telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shattered. Now you're probably like, well, any teacher or librarian that's sharing pornography at the school librarian probably should get in trouble. But they're talking about books like ACOTAR. They're talking about books by Colleen Hoover, Talia Hibbert, and Tessa Bailey. They're talking about the things that Sarah J. Maas has written. They're talking about smut and contemporary romance books, not actual pornography.
Okay.
And anything that has to do with like the changing bodies of women and men, and like anything that has like queer romance in it.
Okay. Wow.
So those are the things that they're saying are considered to be pornography. Blame the queer people and blame the teachers and the librarians, but like never blame the real life predator that's actually like harming these children.
Yes. Correct. Oh, wow. That's actually extremely shocking.
So if Trump becomes president, it's like hide your books.
Hide your books is crazy.
That's where we are now. Isn't there like a book that's really famous for this? Like what's the book? Fahrenheit 451 or something like that? It is
Fahrenheit 460.
Something.
461.
451.
Yeah, I think they had a movie that recently came out.
Michael B. Jordan's in it.
And I think it focuses on the idea of abolishing education.
Abolishing education and getting rid of all the books. And criminalizing all the books. Like I said, this is stuff out of a movie or book. It's kind of wild, but like that's Project 2025 for you. All right. Talking about parenting. The rise of deadbeat dads. Child support in the United States. Under Project 2025, they have policy called the child support tax credit. It would be on a national and state level guidelines and would be updated to ensure that non-resident parents that don't live with their kids with child support orders can receive a child support tax credit. So if you're on child support, Donald Trump wants to give you a tax credit, not the mom that's raising the child, not the mom or the dad that's in the home raising the child, or whatever guardian that's raising the child. The person who's outside of the home should get a tax break. And the reason Elon Musk's face is here is because Donald Trump famously has a relationship with him, and Elon Musk famously, allegedly, is rumored to not pay child support despite being a billionaire and doesn't take good care of his kids when his kids is trans, and apparently he wants nothing to do with that child. So things like that. In Project 2025, it says, quote, "The key to this policy is that it empowers fathers with their own resources and money rather than creating another government assistance program or fully funded refund credit, devoid of the father's own monetary efforts. This way, the non-resident father's role as a financial provider and relation figure is affirmed, and much needed financial resources are given to the children." So basically, their argument is, well, we don't want them to end up too poor after they have to pay child support, so we're giving them a tax break. What's the problem? And further on in Project 2025, and guys, it's 902 pages long. Like, I'm sorry.
That's long.
I can't cite the whole thing for you, so I'm gonna have to paraphrase. But later on in this paragraph where they talk about this, they go on to say that this should encourage women to not want to get a divorce.
Okay, so ultimately goes back to
that. So it all
that.
ties together.
Yeah, I can see.
And Elon Musk would probably benefit greatly from something like this because he would get a huge tax credit break because he pays a lot in child support because he makes a lot of money and he has a lot of kids.
But what if you were never married to begin with? So if he never married the woman that he had children with, like...
He still gets the tax credit break.
Okay.
Because Elon Musk is not married. Perfect example. So... another thing that Project 2025 wants to do is dismantle the administrative state. The administrative state basically means like the Department of Education, the Department of like OSHA, the Department of Health, things of that nature. It says, of course, the surest way to put the federal government back to work for the American people is to reduce its size and its scope back to something resembling the original constitutional intent. So basically, like, we should limit how much they do. He doesn't want to have the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, and that's kind of wild because, like, what are we going to do without the Department of Education? What are we going to do without the Department of Transportation? And, like, I picked this picture because it's, like, Spider-Man, and he's, like, has nothing on his desk. And, like, that's basically, like,
what he's
how they're trying to do it. It's like there's no one here doing anything. Conservatives desire a smaller government, but they want the government to be in the hospital rooms with you when you're trying to get your birth control. But they desire a smaller government, not for its own sake, but for the sake of human flourishing. So they say if we have a smaller government, we get rid of things like Department of Education, Department of Transportation. Then like, what's the problem? Like, it'll be better.
What are some of the issues that will come from these departments being dismantled?
I mean, if you get rid of these are the ones that do the regulatory policies that make sure that things stay in check. So when you get rid of, like, the whole department, who then takes care of all the things that the departments were supposed to do.
Take care, yeah.
And, like, he's talking about getting rid of the federal Department of Education, which is wild because every state has their own individual Department of Education, but, like, we still rely on the federal Department of Education for resources, for fundings for schools, for policies, and all that stuff. So it's like, what's the plan if we get rid of them?
All of them, yeah.
And no one knows what the plan is. I mean, Trump knows what the plan is because he's the one running on Project 2025. Well, not running because he's saying he doesn't know anything about it, but it's just something to keep in mind when you think about this project and this policy initiatives. We talked a lot about abortion, but one of the main things that is highlighted in Project 2025 is the idea of, like, getting rid of abortion altogether.
Yeah.
For Project 2025, ultimately, the end goal is to get rid of abortion. I mean, on the not just on the federal level, but on the state level, because Roe v. Wade has already been overturned. So what else could they possibly want to do to abortion? And that's just like essentially getting rid of it completely, like full stop. Doesn't matter if you need an abortion because you are a victim of incest or rape. Doesn't matter if you're having an atopical pregnancy, which means like you need to have an abortion because the baby has like unfortunately passed inside, and they need to take out the baby so that you don't die yourself. Sometimes people like experience bleeding and all these things.
That's not even into consideration?
Well, Donald Trump says they would go back to the states, but if you live in states like Texas, like what's happening right now as we speak is like women in Texas and doctors are like, women in Texas are experiencing this thing where like their own doctors are too afraid to give them the procedures that they deserve and need because they're afraid of going to jail for giving them those procedures. And then if you go out of state and get those resources, then you can be jailed. And anyone who helps you can be jailed because you got an abortion out of state.
Can you just move now at this point?
Like, you could leave the country, I guess, but it's going to take a while to leave the country. And that's if you have the funding.
Yeah. So this is literally
so if you live in America, you're pretty screwed. I doubt that I doubt the average American right now, in the time of like the cost of gas being what it is, the cost of food being what it is, like I doubt the average American can just pack up and leave and go to Canada. And that's if Canada wants us.
That's another thing.
Yeah, like Canada saw how we acted during COVID-19. Like I wouldn't want us.
That's fair.
Not that Canada doesn't have its own problems, because it does. We'll do an episode on Canada's politics one day, because we can't be the only ones getting dragged on this podcast.
That's fair.
All right, so for much of Christian history, abortion was not a focal point that it became until the 20th century. So I know like there's a lot of like religious undertones behind the abortion conversation in the United States of America.
Yes.
But it actually wasn't something people talked about until like well into the 20th century, which means the 1900s. So back in the day, people didn't talk about it. People didn't have any issues with abortion. What ended up happening was a lot of doctors wanted to privatize medical practices, such as abortion, because women were doing abortion in the homes for other women, like being midwives, doulas, things of that nature. And doctors wanted to be able to privatize it. So then they started talking about scriptural passages regarding the sanctity of life. And those were largely adapted to also include children that haven't been born yet, i.e. fetuses, and then that's how you start the pro-life movement. But it actually all started because doctors wanted to be able to make more money from things like abortion.
It's all about the money.
It's actually funny now, because fast forward to 2024, what was once done to be considered a money grab has now led to doctors being afraid to even do that type of work. The shift in abortion status as a major political religious issue in the 20th century was influenced by a complex mix of factors. So we talked about the criminalization and medicalization of it. Something else was that there was a political strategy for people to be able to use that as a litmus test. Do you know what a litmus test is?
Never heard of it.
It's kind of like where you can see where someone ranges like on a scale. So it's like, like something that could be a litmus test right now is like how people feel about Palestine. That's a litmus test. Or abortion. Like you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. Things like that. So politicians found that like this is a talking point that I can use that like galvanizes people to go vote, that inspires people, that gets people worked up. So like I'm going to use this as a talking point. And since the 20th century, we have still talked about abortion in American politics. So much so that the Heritage Foundation wrote a 902-page document where they like go into full detail about why we should get rid of abortion, why it's not good, why it's destroying the sanctity of life.
Is there a counteract to that?
In Project 2025? No. Project 2025 wants to get rid of abortion, full stop. Doesn't matter what your reasoning is, doesn't matter what state you live in, they want to get rid of it, and that's just where we are right now.
I was more referring to the 900-page essay. Like, was there a rebuttal to that?
No one has made a rebuttal to Project 2025.
That's interesting.
I don't know why. I guess because it's mad work. Like who has the time
to this?
Like, I mean, you could make it and you could make your own policy thing, but like, who's to say the next president is going to take your policy initiative and like follow through? It'd be cool. Be a really cool project to do if like someone kind of like made the opposite of Project 2025 and they were like, this is what. Because Project 2025 is a love letter to right-wing conservatives. Like, if someone did a love letter to left-leaning progressives, what would that look like? That would be really cool. I don't know if anyone's planning on doing that. And it took them some time to come up with Project 2025. So, it might be a few years before we see something similar, but on the other spectrum. But hopefully someone does do that. I'm too busy for it. But someone please, because I would love to see it.
Yeah, I would too. Just not 900.
Yeah, 900 words is actually insane.
Let's condense it.
All right. So what can we do to like address Project 2025 and get ourselves off to a better start? How do we combat this? So we educate ourselves. It's better to read, listen, and learn about what's happening in the country that you live in. And it's important to tell other people about what is going on. Word of mouth makes a huge difference. Most people like don't even really watch the news or like keep up to date themselves. They like have a friend that keeps up to date and they tell other people what that friend said, and hopefully that's what this podcast is.
Right here.
Yeah, I'm like, hopefully this podcast will be that source for you guys. But I think something else that's really important is that you need to vote. Like, half of you guys probably aren't even registered to vote. Like, you probably don't even know when the registration is. That's no bueno. That's no bueno. Like, we have to be serious. We have to be for real. Because Project 2025 is like here and it's ready. And like one thing about conservatives is they know about voting power and they know to vote.
Yeah.
And they vote every year. And like whether we like it or not, whether we think people are being stupid or not, whether we think Project 2025 could never be a thing in place. Remember that we thought Donald Trump would never be president of the United States, and he became president and stacked the Supreme Court and got rid of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
So that was before he had a blueprint with Project 2025. Now he has an actual blueprint map of like what he can do and what laws he can use to implement certain things to get what he wants. Things like the Comstock Act that haven't been used in years. He wants to bring things like that back so that he can ban birth control getting mailed to you. I mean, it's crazy out here, and you're not even registered to vote. It might be time. It may be time to look it up online. Just a thought. Just a thought. All right, so I have some book recommendations for you. If you have time, because I know you're a full-time student and you have a whole life, you could read Project 2025. It's called The Mandate for Leadership. It's 900 plus pages long.
Is there a condensed version?
There's not a condensed version per se, but there are some articles online where people like break it down. There's a lot of YouTube videos where people have broken it down and like and it's a lot of information. So like those videos are like upwards to an hour plus long sometimes. But given how much information is in there, I think it's important to try to get as much as possible through it.
Yeah.
Another book that I'm recommending is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. She's a very famous like author and speechwriter. She has like a lot of books about inspirational books for Black women to kind of read, and you don't have to be Black to read it. I actually was gifted the book by a Filipino friend of mine. It's basically just kind of about the liberation movement and collective liberation and like moving forward and like trying to make a difference. So highly recommend reading Sister Outsider. Another book recommendation we have is How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective. This book is really cool because it kind of talks about the Black liberation movement. It talks about like what's happening in the world. It's supposed to like wake you up and radicalize you. I highly recommend, if you want to know more about what's happening in the world and you want to like really educate yourself, to give this book a read. And if you want to know more about abortion and how abortion became a political topic before it was criminalized and all these things. Yes, I do. I would highly recommend reading The Moral Property of Women. It talks about the history of abortion itself becoming like criminalized and like how it became a thing. How it progressed, Yeah, because for those of you that are religious and Christian, you'll know that nowhere in the Bible does it mention abortion. But that is like such a huge religious like argument in the United States of America. So she goes into great detail about like how that even happened and,
in
like,
the first
why.
place.
And again, I'm not here for anyone to argue whether or not you're pro or against abortion. Like, talk to your mom about that, that's fine. But like, no argument in the comments over like your opinions on it, please. That would be greatly appreciated. And yeah, that's Project 2025. That's everything that Trump has planned for us. And thank you so much, Bear, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I feel like I've learned so much. And yeah, I'm going to check out some of the books that you mentioned. They actually sound really interesting.
Oh, I'm glad. Oh, and for those of you that haven't, please like, comment, and subscribe. Yes, please. Thank you. Oh, and share the video with everyone you know.
You know me.
Oh, bye-bye.